The knock at the door wasn't friendly. It wasn't a polite, "Can I borrow some sugar?" kind of knock. No, it was sharp, deliberate, and entitled. The kind of knock you'd expect from someone who thought they owned the place, or at least thought they should. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door like it might bite me if I got too close. Something about that knock felt like a warning. But then again, when had my ex-wife Grace ever been subtle? I pulled the door open, and there she was. Grace. My ex dressed in designer clothes she likely couldn't afford, with sunglasses perched on her head like she was auditioning for a reality show no one wanted to watch. And beside her stood Daniel, the man she'd married after me, the man she'd left me for. His smirk was the kind that made you want to punch first and ask questions later. He didn't say a word at first, just looked me up and down like I was something he'd scrape off his shoe. Grace wasted no time. "Well, Thomas, aren't you going to invite us in?" I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Depends. Did you bring a gift?" "That's usually what guests do." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, turning her charm dial up to 11. "We're not here for pleasantries. We're here to discuss business." Daniel finally spoke, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Your father's estate. We have some rightful claims, and it's only fair we settle this like adults." "Rightful claims?" I couldn't help but laugh. "You're joking, right? Grace, you left me. You signed the divorce papers. And now you think you're entitled to my father's estate?" Grace stepped forward, her perfume overpowering as she crossed into my space. "Thomas, don't be unreasonable. You know how close I was to your father. He adored me." "Yeah, until he didn't," I interrupted. "Don't rewrite history just because you want a payday." Daniel's smirk grew wider, if that was even possible. "Listen, Tom." "It's Thomas," I corrected. "Only my friends call me Tom, and last I checked, you're not one of them." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he pushed on. "Look, this house is worth millions. Grace was part of this family for years, and as her husband, I think it's only right we discuss what portion of the estate belongs to her, and by extension, to us." The sheer audacity of the man was almost impressive. Almost. "You're not getting a penny," I said flatly, but before I could follow up with something less polite, another voice chimed in from behind me. "Well, this is a fascinating conversation," said Eleanor, my lawyer, stepping into view. She was holding her leather briefcase in one hand, her tablet in the other, and wearing the kind of calm, confident smile that made you believe she could take down an army with just her pen. "Thomas, aren't you going to introduce me?" Grace's face fell, but Daniel was still smirking, though it had morphed into something more uncertain. "And you are?" he asked, his tone teetering between curiosity and annoyance. "Eleanor Price," she said smoothly, "Thomas's attorney. And you must be Daniel, the man who thinks he can waltz in here and lay claim to something that doesn't belong to him. You're even bolder than I imagined." "Attorney?" Grace repeated, her confidence cracking. "Why would Thomas need an attorney?" "Because unlike some people, I like to be prepared," I said, stepping aside to let Eleanor fully into the doorway. "And I had a feeling you'd pull something like this." Eleanor opened her briefcase, pulling out a folder thicker than a dictionary. "Your timing is impeccable," she said to Grace and Daniel. "Thomas and I were just going over the details of Mr. Harrison's will. You know, the one that explicitly outlines who does and doesn't have any legal claim to the estate." The color drained from Grace's face, but Daniel stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster in a barnyard. "This isn't over," he said. "You can play the legal game all you want, but we have rights. We'll see you in court if we have to." Eleanor smiled sweetly, tucking the folder back into her briefcase. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Grace pulled Daniel back, her composure barely holding. "Come on, Daniel," she hissed. "Let's go." As they retreated down the driveway, Daniel threw one last glare over his shoulder. "This isn't the end, Thomas. We'll be back." Looking forward to it, I called after them. I closed the door and turned to Eleanor, who was already flipping through her notes. "Well, that was entertaining," she said. "But you'd better buckle up, Thomas. This is just the beginning." I nodded, feeling the weight of what was coming. My father's legacy meant everything to me, and if Grace and Daniel thought they could take it from me, They were about to learn how wrong they were. After Grace and Daniel's dramatic departure, I sat down in the living room with Eleanor. She was already pulling out more papers from her briefcase, her expression sharper than ever. "You were right," she said, sliding a thick file across the coffee table toward me. "Your father anticipated this. He was meticulous in preparing for exactly this kind of stunt." I opened the file, finding page after page of legal documents, financial records, and correspondence that my father had quietly compiled over the years. It was overwhelming, like seeing a map of a battle plan I didn't even know I was part of. My father had always been a step ahead, and now, even after his death, he was still guiding me. "What is all this?" I asked, flipping through the pages. "Evidence," Eleanor replied, sitting back and crossing her legs. "Your father didn't just write a will. He built a fortress. Every clause, every contingency, it's all designed to protect his estate from people like Grace and Daniel. He knew they'd try something like this." My stomach churned. "You're saying he saw this coming?" Eleanor nodded. "From the moment Grace walked out on you, he started putting plans in motion. He suspected she was only with you for the money, and when the divorce happened, it confirmed his fears. Then, when Daniel entered the picture, your father became even more cautious. He didn't trust either of them." I leaned back in the chair, the weight of my father's foresight settling on my shoulders. "So, what's the plan now?" Eleanor tapped her pen against her notebook. "First, we're going to make sure the will stands exactly as your father intended. Second, we're going to expose Grace and Daniel for who they really are. And finally, we're going to ensure that everything your father worked for stays in the family." Her confidence was reassuring, but it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. Grace and Daniel weren't just greedy, they were shameless. My father had barely been gone long enough for the flowers on his grave to wilt, and they were already circling like vultures. "What do we have on them?" I asked, needing to know how strong our case really was. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Quite a bit, actually. Your father was very thorough. He hired private investigators to look into their activities after the divorce, and the results are damning." She pulled out a smaller folder and handed it to me. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were photos of Grace and Daniel meeting with various people, some of them lawyers, others unrecognizable. One picture showed them in a bank, holding what appeared to be documents. Another showed them in a dimly lit restaurant, speaking with someone who looked suspiciously like a private investigator of their own. "What am I looking at?" I asked, my throat dry. "Evidence of their attempts to contest the will before your father even passed," Eleanor explained. "They've been planning this for months. Daniel, in particular, has been aggressive in trying to find loopholes or weak points they could exploit." I stared at the photos, my blood boiling. Grace and I had shared years together. We weren't perfect, but I'd always believed that, at the very least, she cared about me once. Now it seemed like every moment of our marriage had been part of some larger scheme. "And the will?" I asked, trying to keep my anger in check. "How airtight is it?" "As airtight as it gets," Eleanor assured me. "Your father included a clause, what we call a no-contest clause. It essentially states that if anyone tries to challenge the will, they risk forfeiting their inheritance entirely. So if they fight this, they'll lose everything." A grim sense of satisfaction settled over me. My father hadn't just been cautious, he'd been brilliant. Grace and Daniel thought they could outsmart him, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. "What's next?" I asked, closing the folder and looking at Eleanor. "Next," she said, standing up and gathering her papers, "we prepare for the reading of the will. That's when this will all come to a head. Grace and Daniel are going to think they've won, and when they do, we'll be ready to show them just how wrong they are." I followed her to the door, my resolve hardening with every step. This wasn't just about protecting my father's legacy anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought they could take whatever they wanted without consequence. As Eleanor stepped outside, she turned back to me. "One more thing, Thomas. Your father left you something. It's not in the will, it's separate. I'll bring it to you tomorrow before the reading. He wanted you to have it when the time was right." "What is it?" I asked, curiosity piqued. She smiled. "You'll see." I watched her drive away, my mind racing. Whatever my father had left me, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. Grace and Daniel thought they had this in the bag, but they didn't know what they were walking into. They didn't know who they were up against. The next morning, Eleanor arrived right on time, holding a small leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope in her hands. There was a weight to her expression, one that told me whatever she had brought wasn't just another piece of legal strategy. It was personal. "This belonged to your father," she said, handing me the journal first. "He kept it during his last year, knowing things were coming to a head." I took the journal carefully, running my fingers over the worn leather cover. My father, Richard, had always been a man of quiet reflection, preferring to write down his thoughts rather than voice them aloud. This journal felt like a part of him I hadn't seen before. "What's in it?" I asked. Eleanor gestured for me to open it. His thoughts, suspicions, and plans. But more importantly, the truth about Grace. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with entries about my father's declining health, his concerns for the future, and his determination to protect the family's legacy. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. March 15th. Grace is not the woman Thomas thinks she is. She came into his life with ulterior motives, and while I hoped their love would be genuine, it's clear now that she was only ever after what she thought she could gain. I've been watching her closely, and the signs are all there. Secret phone calls, unexplained trips, and now, Daniel. I paused, the words cutting deeper than I expected. My father had known. He had seen what I refused to acknowledge during my marriage. Grace's betrayal wasn't just personal. It had been calculated. I turned another page. April 2nd. Daniel is dangerous. He doesn't care about Grace beyond what she can deliver. He's pushing her to secure access to the estate, to manipulate me while I'm vulnerable. I won't let them win. I've started documenting everything, leaving no room for doubt when the time comes. Thomas will see the truth, even if it's painful. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. I looked up at Eleanor, who was watching me carefully. "He knew," I said, my voice hoarse. "He knew about all of it." Eleanor nodded. "And he made sure you'd have the tools to fight back." She handed me the envelope next. I opened it to find a letter in my father's handwriting, addressed directly to me. "My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, it means the battle has begun. Grace and Daniel have made their move, just as I knew they would. I'm sorry you have to face this, but I want you to remember one thing. You are not alone. I've given Eleanor everything she needs to ensure the truth comes to light. Trust her, and trust yourself. You're stronger than you think. As for Grace and Daniel, they've underestimated you, and me. They think this is about money, but they're wrong. This is about integrity, about protecting what truly matters. Inside the journal, you'll find evidence of their deceit, but there's more to come. The will is only the beginning. Watch closely, Thomas. The pieces are already falling into place. With love and faith in you, Dad, asterisk. I set the letter down, my chest tight with emotion. Even from beyond the grave, my father was guiding me, standing beside me as I faced the people who had tried to tear our family apart. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, interrupting my thoughts. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "Your father hired a private investigator. This drive contains surveillance footage and audio recordings, everything he uncovered about Grace and Daniel's plans." I stared at the drive, my anger simmering beneath the surface. "What did he find?" Eleanor sighed. "Meetings with lawyers to discuss contesting the will. Bank transfers that suggest Grace was siphoning money from your joint account during your marriage. And Daniel? He's been bribing people left and right, trying to dig up dirt on you and your father." I clenched my fists, the weight of their betrayal crashing over me like a wave. They hadn't just wanted to hurt me, they wanted to destroy everything my father had built. Eleanor placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thomas, this isn't just about defending the estate anymore. It's about showing them they can't get away with this." I nodded, a newfound resolve settling in my chest. "Let's make sure they don't." As Eleanor packed up her things, I picked up my father's journal again, flipping to a page I hadn't read yet. A single phrase stood out, written in bold, deliberate letters. "The truth always comes to light." I closed the journal, the words echoing in my mind. Grace and Daniel thought they could manipulate me, deceive me, and take what wasn't theirs. But they didn't realize that my father had left me more than an inheritance. He'd left me the strength to fight back. The reading of the will was tomorrow, and I was ready for whatever came next. The day of the will reading arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. Grace and Daniel sat across from me at the long conference table, looking far too confident for my liking. Grace was dressed to the nines, her sharp smile a mask of smug superiority, while Daniel lounged beside her, exuding the arrogance of someone who believed he'd already won. Eleanor sat to my left, calm and composed as always, her legal briefcase perched beside her. Across the room, the executor of my father's will, Mr. Warren, adjusted his glasses and prepared to begin. As he opened the official documents, Grace leaned forward, her eyes practically sparkling with anticipation. "Let's get this over with," she said, her voice dripping with fake charm. "We're all here for the same reason." I didn't respond, choosing instead to glance at Eleanor. She gave me a subtle nod, a signal that we were ready for what was about to unfold. Mr. Warren cleared his throat. This will was written and finalized 6 months before Mr. Harrison's passing. It clearly outlines the division of assets, including the estate, business holdings, and financial trusts. Grace practically purred. "Wonderful. I'm sure Richard left instructions that reflect his affection for everyone involved." "Affection?" I muttered under my breath. Eleanor hid a smirk. Mr. Warren continued. "The initial division is as follows. The Harrison estate, including this property, is to be allocated 60% to Thomas Harrison and 40% to us," Grace interrupted, sitting back in triumph. "Exactly as I expected." But Mr. Warren raised his hand, stopping her mid-gloat. "Please let me finish. The 40% allocation is contingent upon the fulfillment of specific conditions outlined in the will. These conditions are detailed in an addendum added 3 days before Mr. Harrison's death." Grace's smile faltered. "What conditions?" Mr. Warren glanced at Eleanor, who took the opportunity to speak. "The conditions involve a clause requiring a thorough investigation of any parties who attempt to claim inheritance under questionable pretenses." Daniel sat up straighter, his smirk replaced with unease. "What does that mean?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but her words hit like a hammer. "It means that any attempt to manipulate Mr. Harrison or his estate activates a no-contest clause. Essentially, if you're caught trying to deceive your way into an inheritance, you lose everything." Grace's confidence began to crack. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We've done nothing wrong." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "Really? Then perhaps you'd like to explain these." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents and photographs, sliding them across the table for everyone to see. Grace hesitated, but Daniel snatched them up, flipping through them with increasing panic. "What is this?" he demanded. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Evidence. Photos of the two of you, meeting with lawyers to discuss contesting the will before Richard even passed. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers from Grace's account during her marriage to Thomas. Emails in which you, Daniel, pressured Richard's staff for information about the estate. Shall I go on?" Grace's face turned pale, but she wasn't ready to back down. "These are lies," she said, her voice shaky. "Fabricated to make us look bad." "Lies?" Eleanor echoed, pulling out another piece of paper. "This is a signed statement from one of Richard's nurses, detailing how you, Grace, attempted to bribe her for details about his health and the will. Still think it's fabricated?" Daniel's composure completely crumbled as he threw the photos back onto the table. "This is a setup," he spat. "You're trying to trap us." "No," Eleanor said, her tone icy. "You trapped yourselves. Richard Harrison was one of the sharpest men I've ever known, and he wasn't about to let anyone take advantage of him or his family." Grace's voice rose, desperate now. "This doesn't prove anything. Richard was old, sick. He probably didn't even know what he was signing." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Grace. Claiming that Richard wasn't of sound mind is a dangerous argument when we have evidence proving your attempts to manipulate him. You'd only incriminate yourself further." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're leaving. This is a waste of time." But before he could storm out, Eleanor dropped her final bombshell. "Leaving won't change what happens next. This evidence is already with the authorities, and any attempt to challenge the will from here on out will result in criminal charges." The room went silent. Grace's hands were trembling now, her carefully constructed facade in shambles. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. I leaned back in my chair, finally allowing myself a small smile. "I warned you not to come here." Grace glared at me, her voice venomous. "You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over." Eleanor stood, collecting her papers with a calm efficiency that only made Grace's fury more pathetic. "Oh, it's over," she said. "You just haven't realized it yet." As Grace and Daniel slinked out of the room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My father's plan was working perfectly. The truth was coming to light, and Grace and Daniel's greed had led them straight into the trap they deserved. I turned to Eleanor. "What's next?" She smiled, her confidence unshaken. "Next? We let them dig their hole even deeper. The courtroom is where this really gets interesting." I nodded, ready for whatever came next. My father had prepared me for this, and I wasn't about to let him down. The day of reckoning was finally here, the courtroom showdown where Grace and Daniel would meet the consequences of their greed. Eleanor and I arrived early, her briefcase practically brimming with the evidence my father had meticulously gathered. The courthouse buzzed with activity, and I could see reporters already circling outside, eager for a sensational story. Inside, the courtroom was filled with an audience of curious onlookers. Grace and Daniel sat at the defendant's table, their expressions a mix of forced calm and barely concealed panic. Grace was impeccably dressed, as usual, but the cracks in her composure were beginning to show. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Their attorney sat between them, whispering hurried reassurances that didn't seem to help. I sat beside Eleanor, who looked as calm and collected as ever. "They're going to fight this," I whispered. "They can try," she replied with a faint smile. "But your father left no loose ends." The judge entered, and the room fell silent. After the formalities, the case began with the reading of the will. The initial terms were straightforward. 60% of the estate was allocated to me, while 40% was to go to Grace and Daniel, contingent on fulfilling specific conditions. Grace sat up straighter, her confidence briefly returning. But then Eleanor stood, her presence commanding the room. "Your Honor, we would like to introduce evidence related to the conditions of the will, as outlined in the addendum." Grace's attorney stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the initial distribution of assets." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Price." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady and precise. "The conditions of the will include a no-contest clause. This clause states that any party attempting to manipulate Mr. Richard Harrison or his estate forfeits their claim entirely. We have evidence that the defendants, Grace and Daniel, engaged in such manipulation." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Grace's attorney scrambled to object again, but the judge waved him off. "Let her continue." Eleanor approached the bench, handing over a stack of documents. These include bank statements, photographs, and signed affidavits detailing the defendant's actions. Notably, we have proof of bribery attempts, fraudulent financial activities, and premeditated plans to contest the will before Mr. Harrison's passing. The judge reviewed the documents, his expression darkening. Grace's attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Daniel leaned over to whisper something to him, but the attorney ignored him, clearly out of his depth. Eleanor continued, her tone sharp. "Furthermore, we have video evidence of Grace and Daniel discussing their plans. This includes a recorded attempt to bribe Mr. Harrison's nurse for information about his condition and the contents of his will." At that, Eleanor pulled out a USB drive and handed it to the court clerk. Moments later, the video played on the courtroom screens. Grace's voice filled the room, unmistakably conniving. "Once the old man's gone, we'll challenge the will. Daniel, you just have to keep pressuring him. He's sick. He'll cave eventually." Grace's face turned white, and Daniel's jaw clenched as murmurs spread through the room. The judge silenced the crowd with a sharp bang of his gavel. "Do you deny this is your voice, Mrs. Grace Mitchell?" Eleanor asked, her words cutting like a knife. Grace hesitated, then stammered, It's taken out of context." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Would you like to hear more context? We have hours of recordings." The room erupted in whispers again, and the judge banged his gavel once more. "Order. Mrs. Mitchell, please answer the question." Grace glanced at Daniel, who offered no help, then back at her attorney. Finally, she slumped in her chair. "No," she muttered. "I don't deny it." That single admission sealed their fate. Eleanor wasn't done yet. "Your Honor, I would also like to present evidence of financial fraud committed by the defendants. These bank statements show that Mrs. Mitchell funneled money from her joint account with Mr. Harrison during their marriage, transferring funds to accounts under her maiden name. Mr. Daniel Mitchell was complicit in these actions." Daniel exploded. "That's a lie." Eleanor calmly slid another document across the table. "These records beg to differ, Mr. Mitchell. You see, Mr. Harrison was thorough. He hired private investigators who tracked every dollar and every meeting. Your lies and schemes are all laid bare." The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Do the defendants have any response to these allegations?" Grace's attorney stood shakily. "Your Honor, my clients respectfully decline to comment at this time." The judge nodded grimly. "Then we'll proceed." The courtroom was silent except for the occasional scribble of reporters' pens and the judge's deliberate flipping of documents. Grace and Daniel sat rigidly, their earlier bravado long gone. The walls were closing in on them, and they knew it. The prosecution called me to the stand. As I walked past Grace and Daniel, I caught the faint hint of desperation in Grace's eyes, a glimmer of the control she was rapidly losing. Daniel, however, wouldn't even look at me. "Please state your name for the court," the prosecutor began. "Thomas Harrison," I said, my voice steady. "Mr. Harrison, can you describe your relationship to the defendants?" I glanced briefly at Grace and Daniel before answering. "Grace Mitchell is my ex-wife, and Daniel Mitchell is her current husband." The prosecutor nodded. "And during your marriage, did you observe any behavior from Mrs. Mitchell that might indicate financial misconduct or manipulation?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to steady myself. "Yes," I said finally. "Grace often withdrew large sums of money without explanation. When I questioned her about it, she would dismiss my concerns or claim it was for household expenses." "Did these withdrawals continue after your divorce?" "They did," I confirmed. "I later learned she had accessed our joint accounts during the divorce proceedings, transferring money into private accounts under her maiden name." Grace's attorney stood abruptly. "Objection. This is speculative and irrelevant." The judge waved him off. "Overruled. The witness may continue." The prosecutor leaned in. "Mr. Harrison, are you aware of any actions taken by the defendants regarding your late father, Mr. Richard Harrison?" I nodded. "Yes. Grace and Daniel both attempted to manipulate my father in his final months. They visited him frequently, claiming to care about his well-being, but in reality, they were pressuring him for details about his will and estate." Gasps rippled through the audience, and I caught Grace shooting daggers at me with her eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. "Did your father ever share his suspicions about their intentions?" the prosecutor asked. I nodded again. "He did. My father was a cautious man, and he saw through their act. He even documented their attempts to manipulate him." "Can you elaborate on that documentation?" "My father hired private investigators to gather evidence. He collected photos, financial records, and even video recordings of their actions. He wanted to ensure his legacy was protected." The prosecutor approached the judge. "Your Honor, we would like to submit into evidence the surveillance footage provided by Mr. Richard Harrison." The court clerk loaded the footage onto the screens. The first clip showed Grace and Daniel in a hospital hallway, whispering conspiratorially. Grace's voice echoed through the room. "Once the will is read, we'll contest it. Daniel, you need to keep pushing him. Remind him how much I've sacrificed for this family." The second clip showed Daniel meeting with an unknown man in a parking lot. exchanging a thick envelope. The prosecutor explained, "This is footage of Mr. Mitchell bribing a nurse for confidential information about Mr. Harrison's health." Grace covered her face with her hands, while Daniel sat frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. The courtroom murmured, the air thick with tension. The prosecutor turned back to me. "Mr. Harrison, what impact has this situation had on you?" I took a deep breath. Losing my father was devastating enough, but to watch Grace and Daniel try to exploit his death for their own gain, it's been infuriating and heartbreaking. My father built his legacy with hard work and integrity, and I refuse to let them tarnish it. The prosecutor nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. No further questions." As I returned to my seat, Grace's attorney rose to cross-examine me, but before he could begin, Grace stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is a sham," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. Richard was a stubborn old man who didn't know what he was doing in the end. This so-called evidence doesn't prove anything. The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Mitchell, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." But Grace wasn't done. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you've won, don't you, Thomas? You think you're better than me because you're sitting there with that smug look on your face. Well, let me tell you something. You're nothing. Without your father's money, you'd have nothing." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the judge's gavel thundered repeatedly. "Order. Mrs. Mitchell, that's enough." Daniel slouched in his chair, his head in his hands, clearly wishing he could disappear. Grace's attorney tried to calm her, but she shoved him away, continuing her tirade. "You'll regret this, Thomas. Mark my words." Two bailiffs approached and began escorting her out of the courtroom. She fought against them, yelling over her shoulder, "This isn't over." The judge ordered a recess, and Eleanor turned to me, her expression satisfied. "Well, that was better than I could have hoped for." Her outburst just sealed their fate. "She completely lost it," I said, still processing what had just happened. Eleanor nodded. The jury saw everything they needed to see. Grace and Daniel's schemes, their entitlement, and now their true colors. As we left the courtroom for a short break, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The evidence was airtight, and Grace's meltdown had only solidified our case. My father's careful planning was paying off, and soon, justice would be served. After the courtroom recess, I returned to my seat, my mind swirling with thoughts of everything that had unfolded. Grace's meltdown was still fresh in everyone's mind, her outburst having left the jury with no doubt about her true nature. Daniel's silence, his unwillingness to defend her or even himself, only further cemented their guilt. Eleanor sat beside me, calm and focused as ever. But before the judge resumed proceedings, she leaned over and whispered, "There's one more thing your father planned that I haven't shared yet. It's time to play the final card." "What is it?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. She gave me a small, conspiratorial smile. "You'll see soon enough." The judge returned, and the proceedings resumed. The prosecutor stood and announced, "Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence to submit, a statement recorded by Mr. Richard Harrison shortly before his passing." The room fell silent. Grace, now visibly shaken and pale, exchanged a nervous glance with Daniel. The judge nodded, granting the request, and the court clerk prepared the video. The screen came to life, and there he was, my father. Richard Harrison appeared thinner and frilier than I remembered, but his voice was as firm and commanding as ever. He sat in his favorite leather chair, the bookshelves of his study framing him in the background. "If you're watching this," he began, "then my suspicions have been confirmed. Grace and Daniel have attempted to claim a part of my estate through manipulation and deceit. To them, I say this: your greed has blinded you to the fact that this was never about money. It was about integrity, about the values this family was built upon." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Grace, you entered my son's life under false pretenses, pretending to care for him while secretly plotting your own gain. And Daniel, you saw an opportunity to exploit that and took it without a second thought. But you underestimated me. You underestimated my son. And now, The consequences of your actions are unavoidable. The courtroom was completely still as my father continued. To my son, Thomas, I leave not just my estate but the responsibility to uphold our family's legacy. Thomas, I know this has been difficult, but you've handled it with strength and dignity. I'm proud of you. He paused, his expression softening briefly before hardening again. To those who think they can take what doesn't belong to them, remember this: the truth always finds its way to the light. And when it does, you will have no one to blame but yourselves. The video ended, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Grace looked as if she'd been physically struck, while Daniel's head hung low, his defeat written all over him. The prosecutor stood again, his voice calm and resolute. Your Honor, this video, along with the overwhelming evidence presented, demonstrates the defendant's intent to manipulate Mr. Harrison and his estate. We request that the court enforce the no contest clause in Mr. Harrison's will, barring Grace and Daniel Mitchell from receiving any inheritance. Grace's attorney feebly attempted to object, but the judge silenced him with a single raised hand. Enough. The evidence speaks for itself. The judge turned his attention to Grace and Daniel. Your actions have been nothing short of reprehensible. You betrayed a man's trust, manipulated his family, and tried to profit from his passing. The court hereby enforces the no contest clause. Grace and Daniel Mitchell are disqualified from any claim to the Harrison estate. The gavel struck, and it was over. Grace let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. Daniel simply slumped in his seat, looking like a man who had lost everything, because he had. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor and I stayed behind for a moment. She pulled out a sealed envelope from her bag and handed it to me. Your father asked me to give this to you once the case was resolved. I opened it carefully, revealing another handwritten letter. Thomas, if you're reading this, it means justice has been served. But this letter isn't about them. It's about you. I wanted you to know how much I believed in you, how proud I am of the man you've become. This fight wasn't just about protecting the estate. It was about ensuring you understood your worth and strength. In the desk drawer of my study, you'll find one last surprise. It's something I hope will help you move forward and continue building the legacy we started together. With love, Dad. My hands trembled as I read the letter. Eleanor smiled softly. He thought of everything, didn't he? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Let's go, I finally said. I want to see what he left. Back at the house, I opened the drawer my father had mentioned. Inside, I found another envelope, this one containing a deed. It was for a piece of land adjacent to my father's estate, with a note attached. This is for you, Thomas. I bought it because I knew you'd make something beautiful out of it. Whatever you choose to do, know that I'll always be with you. I sat back, overwhelmed by the depth of my father's foresight and love. He hadn't just left me his estate. He'd left me a future, one filled with possibilities and the strength to move forward. That evening, as I stood in my father's garden, the weight of the past weeks finally began to lift. The roses he had planted swayed gently in the breeze, a reminder of his enduring presence. I thought of his words, the truth always finds its way to the light. It had, and now, it was time to rebuild. Not just for myself, but for the legacy my father had entrusted to me. The courtroom may have ruled in my favor, but the fallout from Grace and Daniel's actions was far from over. The media frenzy that followed was relentless, plastering their schemes and eventual downfall across every major news outlet. Reporters camped outside my father's estate, eager for quotes or sound bites, but Eleanor expertly shielded me from the chaos. Keep a low profile for now, she advised. Let the storm pass. You don't owe anyone your story. She was right. I had nothing to prove, but watching Grace and Daniel's public humiliation unfold brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. A few days after the trial, I received a call from Eleanor. The DA's office has finalized the charges, she said. Grace and Daniel are facing multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted bribery. Daniel's cooperation during the investigation might reduce his sentence, but Grace. She paused, her tone heavy. Grace could be looking at 10 to 15 years. I exhaled slowly, processing the weight of it all. Grace had always been manipulative, but I never thought she'd fall this far. Her desperation had blinded her to the reality of her actions, and now, she was paying the price. "What about Daniel?" I asked. "He's agreed to testify against her," Eleanor replied. "It's his best chance at a lighter sentence. Not exactly the loyal husband she thought he was." I almost laughed at the irony. Daniel, who had schemed and plotted alongside Grace, was now throwing her under the bus to save himself. It was poetic justice in a way. The more the police and DA dug into their actions, the more incriminating evidence surfaced. Grace's attempts to manipulate my father weren't her first offense. She had a long history of targeting wealthy individuals, dating back years. Offshore accounts, fake business ventures, and fraudulent documents all pointed to a well-practiced con artist. But this time, she'd made a fatal error, underestimating my father. His meticulous planning and foresight had caught her in a web of her own making. I thought about the private investigators my father had hired, the surveillance footage, the recordings, every piece of evidence he had so carefully gathered. He had known exactly how this would play out, and he had ensured she wouldn't escape accountability. A week after the trial, Eleanor convinced me to hold a brief press conference. "Control the narrative," she said. "Show them you're moving forward." Standing in front of a crowd of reporters, I took a deep breath and began. My father was a man of integrity, a man who believed in justice and hard work. His legacy was never about wealth. It was about the values he instilled in me and everyone who knew him. While recent events have been difficult, they've reminded me of the importance of protecting what truly matters: family, honesty, and resilience. I want to thank the court for ensuring justice was served and my father's wishes were honored. As for me, I plan to honor his legacy by continuing the work he started. I didn't take questions afterward. There was nothing more to say. With the court battle behind me, I turned my attention back to the estate. Walking through the house and garden, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This wasn't just a house. It was a testament to my father's love and dedication. Every brick, every tree, every flower bed held memories of him. But it wasn't enough to simply preserve what he had built. I wanted to expand it, to create something that would honor his legacy for generations to come. Eleanor and I sat down to discuss the next steps. "The land your father bought next to the estate," she said. "What do you want to do with it?" I thought about it for a long moment before replying. "I want to create a public garden, something beautiful and open to everyone." My father believed in sharing what he had, and I think he'd love the idea. Eleanor smiled. "Harrison Gardens," she said. "It has a nice ring to it." Not long after the press conference, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Grace. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I even wanted to hear what she had to say. Inside was a single page, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "Thomas, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed to say this. I was wrong about everything. I let greed and pride destroy what we had, and I regret it more than you'll ever know. You were a good man, and your father was a great one. I failed to see that when it mattered. I don't blame you for what happened. I blame myself. I hope you find peace. Grace." I folded the letter and set it aside. It didn't change anything, but maybe, just maybe, it meant she had finally begun to understand the gravity of her actions. Months passed, and the land my father had purchased began to transform. Harrison Gardens became a reality, a sprawling, vibrant space filled with the flowers and plants my father had loved so much. Visitors from all walks of life came to enjoy its beauty, and with every bloom, I felt a deeper connection to my father's spirit. Eleanor and Isaiah, my cousin, who had stepped in to help during the chaos, stood beside me during the grand opening. "He'd be proud," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "I hope so," I replied, looking out at the crowd. This is what he wanted. Not just justice, but growth. And that's what it was. Grace and Daniel had tried to take everything from me, but they'd failed. My father's legacy remained intact, stronger than ever. And as the garden bloomed around me, I knew I'd found something even more valuable than justice. I'd found peace. The garden was flourishing. Bright, vibrant flowers swayed gently in the breeze, a living testament to my father's legacy. Harrison Gardens had become more than just a project. It was a symbol of resilience, growth, and new beginnings. Months after the courtroom battles and public fallout, life finally began to settle. The chaos that Grace and Daniel had brought into my life felt like a distant memory, their influence reduced to lessons learned and strength gained. My father's words echoed in my mind often. The truth always finds its way to the light. One morning, Isaiah, my cousin, and one of the few family members who had stood by me, visited the garden. He'd been instrumental in managing the estate while I focused on building something meaningful. "This place is incredible, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with admiration as he walked along the garden paths. "Your father would have loved this." I smiled, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. He always said beauty can grow in the hardest soil. I think this proves him right. Isaiah nodded, then hesitated. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to expand this even further. A community center, maybe? Something that could offer more than just beauty, education, resources, a place where people can connect." His suggestion caught me off guard, but also sparked something in me. My father's legacy wasn't just about the garden. It was about giving back, about building something lasting. I nodded slowly. "Let's do it. Let's make this more than just a garden." One afternoon, as I sorted through old files in my father's study, I came across Grace's letter again. I hadn't thought about it much since the day I read it, but something compelled me to pick it up. Her words still carried the weight of regret, but I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel anything, really, just a quiet sense of closure. Grace and Daniel had made their choices, and they were living with the consequences. I had no intention of responding, but I also had no desire to hold on to the bitterness they tried to leave behind. I placed the letter in a drawer, closing it both literally and figuratively. It was time to let go completely. The day of the official opening for Harrison Gardens was sunny and warm, as if the weather itself was blessing the occasion. Families, couples, and individuals from all over the community came to see what we had built. The laughter of children echoed through the garden, blending with the soft rustle of leaves and the hum of bees. Eleanor stood beside me, holding a cup of coffee. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it," I corrected her. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, raising her cup in a toast. "To Richard Harrison, a man who knew how to plan for everything." "To Dad," I said, raising my own invisible toast. "And to second chances." As the months rolled on, Harrison Gardens grew into something I could never have imagined. We added a small cafe, a library corner, and even hosted workshops on gardening and sustainability. The community center Isaiah suggested became a reality, offering free classes, events, and resources to those in need. The garden had become a hub of life and activity, a place where people came to find peace, connection, and inspiration. It was everything my father would have wanted, and more. One evening, as I walked through the garden at sunset, I found myself stopping at a small plaque I had placed near the entrance. It read, "In loving memory of Richard Harrison, a man who taught us that even in the hardest soil, something beautiful can grow." I ran my fingers over the engraving, a lump forming in my throat. My father had done more than protect his legacy. He had given me the tools to build one of my own. As I stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something. This was my new beginning. Grace and Daniel were the past, their schemes nothing more than shadows. What mattered now was the life I was building, one bloom at a time. The truth had come to light, justice had been served, and now it was time to move forward, to grow, to bloom, to live. And with that, the journey came full circle, not just for me, but for everyone touched by my father's life and legacy.